Mississippi holds more Dogman sightings than people realize, and after months of digging through accounts, old records, and folklore, I think I know why. The combination of terrain, isolation, and something deeper in the landscape makes this state a hotspot for encounters with these bipedal wolf creatures. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I started researching Dogman encounters about 2 years ago after stumbling across a pattern I could not ignore. While Michigan and Wisconsin get all the attention in cryptid circles, Mississippi kept appearing in witness reports with a consistency that demanded investigation. The accounts were different from other states, more visceral, more frequent, and often involving multiple witnesses in the same general areas. That last detail caught my attention most of all. The geography of Mississippi is unlike anywhere else in America. The state sits at a unique intersection of ecosystems, where bottomland hardwood forests meet cypress tupelo swamps, where the Mississippi Delta stretches for hundreds of miles, creating vast corridors of dense wilderness. Nearly 2/3 of Mississippi remains forested despite centuries of logging and agriculture. These are not the open pine forests you see in other southern states, but thick, impenetrable tangles of undergrowth, vines, and standing water. The Mississippi alluvial plain, which locals just call the Delta, is one of the largest remaining forested wetlands in North America. During flood seasons, which happen with predictable regularity, vast sections of this landscape go underwater for weeks or months at a time. The water creates natural barriers that isolate sections of forest, turning them into temporary islands where wildlife, and potentially other things, can move without human interference. The terrain shifts constantly, channels change course, and what was solid ground one year becomes swamp the next. This constant transformation means vast sections of Mississippi remain unexplored and unmapped in any meaningful way. Satellite images show green canopy but reveal nothing of what moves beneath those trees. The forests here are old in a way that defies easy description, not necessarily in the age of individual trees, but in the sense that these ecosystems have remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. The same species of oak and hickory that covered this land when the Chickasaw and Choctaw peoples lived here still dominate the landscape today. What makes Mississippi particularly interesting for Dogman encounters is the abundance of wildlife corridors. Black bears returned to the state in significant numbers over the past 2 decades, proving that large predators can thrive here without human detection for extended periods. The Louisiana black bear was removed from the endangered species list in 2016, a conservation success that demonstrated how effectively these forests can hide and sustain large animals. If a bear population can go unnoticed for decades, what else might be living in these same forests? The terrain provides everything a large predator would need. Deer populations in Mississippi are among the highest in the southeast, providing abundant prey. The bottomland forests offer shelter with their dense canopy and thick undergrowth that limits visibility to a few yards in any direction. Water sources are everywhere, from slow-moving creeks to oxbow lakes to seasonal wetlands. Most importantly, human presence is minimal across vast stretches of this landscape. You can drive for hours through rural Mississippi and see more forest than houses. My research led me to focus on 3 specific encounters that I believe reveals something significant about the Dogman phenomenon in Mississippi. These are not random sightings, but detailed accounts from credible witnesses who had extended encounters, sometimes over multiple days. The patterns in their stories, the consistency of descriptions, and the geographic clustering of events suggest something real is happening in these forests. I have changed some identifying details to protect the witnesses, but the core facts remain as they were reported to me. The first encounter took place in the summer of 1948, near Taylor, Mississippi, a small town in Lafayette County in the north-central part of the state. A family living on a ranch at the edge of town began noticing disturbances on their property that escalated over several weeks. It started with their livestock behaving strangely, refusing to go into certain pastures even when driven, huddling together in the barn at night when they normally spread out. The family owned chickens, goats, and a few cattle, and all of them showed signs of extreme stress. The man who owned the ranch worked as a logger and initially dismissed the behavior as a response to coyotes, or perhaps a black bear passing through the area. Mississippi had few confirmed bear sightings at that time, but he knew they existed in the deeper forests. He set up watch one night with his rifle, sitting on the porch from dusk until well past midnight. He saw nothing unusual but heard something that made his skin crawl, a low howling that did not sound like any coyote or dog he had ever heard. The sound came from multiple directions, as if several animals were communicating across the forest that bordered his property. Over the next few days, the family found tracks around the barn and near the tree line. The prints were large, roughly the size of a human foot but longer and narrower, with clear claw marks at the front of each toe. What disturbed them most was that the tracks showed both four-legged and two-legged movement patterns in the same trail. A section near the barn showed prints from something walking upright for at least 20 yards before the gait changed, and the prints indicated a four-legged lope into the woods. The situation escalated when their dog vanished one evening. The animal had been chained near the house, a large mixed breed that the family used for hunting and protection. In the morning, they found the chain still attached to its post, but torn apart with raw force. No blood, no signs of struggle beyond some disturbed earth, just the broken chain and an empty collar. The family searched the surrounding forest but found nothing. Other families in the area reported similar losses around the same time, dogs and small livestock disappearing without explanation. The rancher reached out to other loggers he worked with, men who spent their days in the deep forests and knew the wildlife intimately. Several of them agreed to help him investigate his property and set traps for whatever predator was responsible. They arrived one weekend with rifles, traps, and the kind of confidence that comes from years of working in the wilderness. That confidence lasted until nightfall on their first evening there. The group set up camp near the barn where they could watch both the house and the tree line. As darkness fell, they heard movement in the forest, branches breaking under significant weight. The sounds moved in a wide circle around the property, always staying just beyond the range of their firelight. Then they heard the howling again, multiple voices calling back and forth in a pattern that sounded coordinated and deliberate. The loggers, men who had spent decades in these forests, admitted they had never heard anything like it. Around midnight, something stepped to the edge of the firelight. The man who first saw the Dogman described it in detail that never varied in the years afterward. It stood on two legs at roughly 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders covered in dark fur. The head was distinctly canine with a long snout and pointed ears that swiveled independently to track sounds. The arms were longer than human arms and ended in hands that showed both finger-like digits and curved claws. The creature did not charge or threaten them directly, but stood watching from perhaps 30 yards away, its eyes reflecting the firelight in that distinctive green-yellow glow that canine eyes produce. One of the loggers raised his rifle and fired a warning shot over the Dogman's head. The creature dropped to all fours and vanished into the darkness with a speed that shocked everyone present. The sound of it moving through the undergrowth suggested something large and powerful, but they heard no yelp or cry of pain. The shot had been meant to scare it away, and initially they thought it had worked. The forest went quiet for perhaps 10 minutes, long enough for them to start breathing normally again. Then they realized the sounds had not stopped, but multiplied. The howling came from at least 4 different directions now, surrounding the camp. The family and the loggers made a decision to retreat to the house and wait for daylight. They spent the rest of the night inside with rifles pointed at the windows, listening to sounds of movement around the property. Something heavy scraped against the side of the barn. Something else rattled the chicken coop hard enough to send the birds into panicked squawking. Shadows moved past the windows, too tall and wrong-shaped to be anything that should exist. At first light, they found tracks everywhere. The ground around the house and barn showed dozens of prints, both four-legged and bipedal, all roughly the same size and shape. Whatever had surrounded them during the night had been multiple Dogman creatures working together with clear coordination. The group walked the property in daylight and found more evidence that disturbed them deeply. scratch marks high up on trees, at least 8 or 9 feet off the ground, gouged deep into the bark. Scent markings that smelled of musk and wet dog, but stronger and more pungent than anything natural. The family tried to continue living on the ranch, but the encounters persisted. Livestock continued to vanish or show up with injuries that suggested they had been grabbed and released, rather than hunted for food. The psychological toll was severe, especially on the children who could not sleep through the night without hearing sounds from the forest. After several months of this, the family made the decision to leave. They sold what property they could and moved more than 50 miles away to a different county where the forests were less dense and the land more open. What makes this encounter significant is not just the detail of the descriptions, but the number of witnesses involved and the extended timeline. This was not a fleeting glimpse or a case of misidentification. Multiple people saw the Dogman creatures over multiple nights, with enough light and proximity to provide consistent descriptions. The coordination between the creatures suggested intelligence beyond simple pack hunting, a deliberate strategy to terrorize and drive the family away from territory the Dogman creatures considered their own. The second encounter I researched occurred much more recently, in the summer of 2015, and involved a power company lineman working in a remote area near the same town of Taylor. The concentration of encounters in this particular region is notable and suggests either a stable population of Dogman creatures or specific geographic features that make the area attractive to them. Taylor sits at the edge of the Holly Springs National Forest, with vast stretches of bottomland hardwoods and cypress swamps extending in multiple directions. The lineman was performing routine maintenance on power lines that ran through a section of forest about 8 miles from the nearest paved road. The company had cut access roads into the forest decades earlier, rough dirt tracks that were barely maintained and often impassable after heavy rain. He drove out alone early one morning in his work truck, expecting to spend the day checking connections and replacing damaged insulators. The area was remote enough that he saw no other vehicles and heard no sounds of human activity once he left the main road. The work went normally until mid-afternoon when he began to feel watched. This is a sensation that many people dismiss, but anyone who spends significant time in wild places learns to trust it. The feeling of being observed creates a physical response, a prickling awareness that something is paying attention to your movements. The lineman looked around, but saw nothing unusual, just the typical wall of green vegetation and the power lines cutting through it in a straight corridor. He continued working, but could not shake the feeling. Then he heard movement in the undergrowth to his left, something large pushing through the brush parallel to his position. He called out, thinking it might be a deer or possibly another worker, but received no response. The movement stopped when he called out, which struck him as odd behavior for wildlife. Deer bolt when startled. They do not freeze and listen. He returned to his work but kept glancing toward the tree line. An hour later, he saw the Dogman for the first time. It stood partially concealed behind a large oak tree about 40 yards from his truck, watching him with clear intent. The lineman's first thought was that someone was playing a prank, wearing a costume to scare him. That thought lasted only until the Dogman shifted position and he saw the fluid, natural movement of muscles under fur, the way the creature's weight distributed as it stepped forward. No costume moves like that, with the unconscious grace of a real animal. The Dogman stood upright on 2 legs, roughly 6.5 to 7 feet tall, with a powerful build. Dark gray fur covered its body with lighter coloring on the chest and throat. The head was distinctly wolf-like with a long muzzle and pointed ears, but the neck was thicker and more muscular than any wolf. The eyes were the most striking feature, amber-colored and forward-facing like a primate's, rather than the side-set eyes of a typical canine. Those eyes tracked the lineman's movements with obvious intelligence and interest. The lineman backed slowly toward his truck, never taking his eyes off the Dogman. He reached the driver's door and pulled it open, his hand shaking as he grabbed the handle. The Dogman did not approach but did not retreat either, maintaining its position at the tree line. The lineman got into the truck and started the engine, expecting the noise to frighten the creature away. Instead, the Dogman tilted its head in a gesture that looked eerily human, as if it were curious about the truck rather than afraid of it. He drove away from that location but had to continue working the power line, which meant traveling deeper into the forest on the same access road. For the next 3 hours, he periodically saw the dogmen, or possibly multiple dogmen creatures, following him. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of movement in the trees, parallel to the road. Other times he would finish work on a pole and turn around to see a shape watching from the edge of the clearing, before melting back into the forest. The creatures never approached closer than 30 or 40 yards, but maintained a constant presence. What disturbed him most was the realization that they were coordinating their movements. At one point he was working on a pole when he heard sounds from both sides of the road simultaneously, as if 2 dogman creatures were flanking him. He looked left and saw one shape moving through the undergrowth, then looked right and saw another. Both were maintaining the same distance from him, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. It felt less like stalking and more like herding, as if they were keeping him contained within a specific area. As the sun began to set, the lineman made the decision to leave the job unfinished and return the next day with a colleague. Company policy discouraged working alone in remote areas, but the policy was often ignored for routine maintenance. The isolation had never bothered him before, but the constant presence of the dogman creatures transformed the forest from a workplace into something that felt actively hostile. He drove out as quickly as the rough roads allowed, checking his mirrors constantly to see if anything followed. The next morning he returned with a coworker and a supervisor. He told them a vague story about wildlife concerns without specifying what he had seen, knowing how it would sound. They drove out to finish the work together. 3 men in 2 trucks with radios to stay in contact. The forest felt different with other people present, less oppressive, but the lineman couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. At one point, all 3 men heard something large moving through the forest. Heavy footfalls that stopped whenever they stopped talking. The supervisor made a comment about bears being active in the area, but the lineman knew what he had seen was not a bear. Bears have a distinctive way of moving, a rolling gait that is immediately recognizable. The dogman creatures moved with a deliberate, almost human stride when upright, and with the loping grace of a wolf when on all fours. The way they watched and followed suggested predatory intelligence rather than the curious caution of a bear encountering humans. The lineman finished his work in that area but requested reassignment to other service locations afterward. He did not file an official report about the dogman encounters, knowing how such a report would be received by his supervisors and co-workers. But he spoke privately to people in the local area, asking if others had seen anything unusual in those same forests. Several people admitted to having strange experiences in the woods around Taylor, most declining to provide details but confirming they avoided certain areas after dark. The third encounter I want to discuss happened in late 2022 on a back road connecting Taylor to the town of Oxford. 2 men were driving home around 11 at night after visiting a friend, taking a shortcut through a rural area to avoid traffic. The driver had grown up in the area and knew the roads well, confident even on the narrow county routes that twisted through forests and farmland. The night was clear with a half moon providing decent visibility, and the drive should have been routine. About halfway through the route, their GPS signal died. This is not uncommon in rural Mississippi where cell coverage is spotty, but the timing felt off. The driver continued based on memory, following the road as it curved through a section of dense forest. The trees on both sides grew close to the road, creating a tunnel effect, with the canopy meeting overhead. Visibility dropped significantly despite the moonlight, and the headlights seemed to barely penetrate the darkness ahead. They first heard the sound of something running parallel to the vehicle in the tree line to their right. At highway speeds it would have been impossible for anything to keep pace, but they were driving slowly on the rough back road, probably 35 or 40 miles per hour. The sound continued for several hundred yards, something large crashing through the undergrowth at the same speed they were traveling. The passenger rolled down his window to listen better, and immediately smelled something strong and musky, like wet dog but with a sharper, more pungent quality. Then they saw the eyes, 2 sets of eyes reflecting their headlights from the roadside ahead, positioned at roughly human head height. The driver's first thought was deer. But deer do not stand at that height, and deer eyes do not reflect that particular shade of amber green. As they got closer, the eyes moved, shifting position in a way that confirmed the creatures were walking upright. The driver slowed down to about 20 miles per hour, uncertain whether to stop or continue. The Dogman creatures stepped partially into the road, standing perhaps 30 feet in front of the vehicle. There were two of them, both standing on their hind legs, one slightly taller than the other. Their fur appeared dark brown or black in the headlights, and both had the distinctive wolf-shaped heads with pointed ears. The taller one opened its mouth in what might have been a threat display, revealing teeth that caught the light. Neither man spoke for several seconds, frozen in the surreal moment of seeing something that should not exist blocking their path. The driver made a split-second decision and accelerated, driving straight toward the Dogman creatures. His logic was simple: if they were real animals, they would move, and if they were somehow men in costumes, they would definitely move to avoid being hit. The Dogman creatures held their ground until the vehicle was perhaps 15 feet away. Then both dropped to all fours and leaped off the road with explosive speed. The car passed through the space where they had been standing less than a second earlier. In the rearview mirror, the driver saw both Dogman creatures come back onto the road behind them, standing upright again and watching the vehicle depart. One of them, he could not say which in the chaos of the moment, tilted its head back and released a howling sound that carried clearly even through the closed windows and over the engine noise. The sound was not like a dog or a wolf, but had a quality that was more primal and disturbing, a vocalization that conveyed both warning and rage. They drove without stopping until they reached a gas station with bright lights and other people. Only then did they pull over, both shaking with adrenaline and the shock of what they had seen. The passenger wanted to call the police, but the driver talked him out of it, arguing correctly that no one would believe them and a report would only subject them to ridicule. They sat in the gas station parking lot for nearly an hour, drinking coffee and trying to process the encounter, before finally driving the rest of the way home on well-lit main roads. The driver returned to that section of road several times afterward, always during daylight, trying to find physical evidence of what he had seen. He found tracks in the soft earth at the roadside, large canid prints that were bigger than any dog tracks he had seen before. He took photos with his phone but knew they would prove nothing conclusive to skeptics. Tracks can be faked, and even genuine, unusual tracks could be dismissed as coming from a large domestic dog or possibly a wolf that had wandered south from reintroduction areas farther north. What links these three encounters is not just their proximity in the same general region of Mississippi, but the consistent descriptions of Dogman behavior and appearance. All the witnesses described creatures standing 6.5 to 7 feet tall, when upright, covered in dark fur, with wolf-like heads and forward-facing eyes that showed clear intelligence. All noted the creature's ability to move on both 2 legs and 4 legs with equal facility. Most significantly, all reported encounters with multiple Dogman creatures rather than solitary animals, suggesting these entities live and hunt in coordinated packs. The question then becomes, why Mississippi specifically, and why the area around Taylor in particular? The answer lies in the intersection of geography, prey availability, and human population patterns. Taylor sits at the edge of vast forested areas that remain largely undeveloped and untrafficked. The Holly Springs National Forest covers more than 150,000 acres, much of it bottomland, hardwoods, and wetlands that are difficult for humans to access. Beyond that lies even more forest, private timberland, and conservation areas where human presence is minimal. The forest structure in this region provides ideal habitat for large predators. The dense understory limits visibility and provides concealment, while the old-growth trees create a canopy that blocks aerial observation. A creature moving through these forests would be virtually invisible from above and difficult to track even on the ground, unless you knew exactly what to look for and where to look. The seasonal flooding creates natural barriers that compartmentalize the forest into sections, each one effectively isolated from the others for months at a time. Prey availability is another crucial factor. Mississippi supports some of the highest white-tailed deer populations in the United States, with density estimates in some areas exceeding 40 deer per square mile. Feral hogs, another abundant prey species, have exploded across the state in recent decades, with populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Both species provide substantial biomass for large predators. A pack of dogman creatures, if they exist, would find easy hunting in these forests with minimal competition from other predators. The historical absence of large predators in Mississippi may actually work in favor of dogman creatures remaining undetected. Black bears only recently returned to the state in significant numbers, and mountain lions have not had a confirmed breeding population in Mississippi for decades. The ecological niche for an apex predator has been open, with only humans, coyotes, and bobcats filling predator roles. A species that evolved or adapted to avoid human contact could potentially thrive in this environment with relatively little pressure. Human population density in the rural parts of Mississippi is among the lowest in the eastern United States. Large sections of the state have fewer than 10 people per square mile, and some areas drop below 5. The people who do live in these rural regions tend to stay on established roads and develop properties. The deep forests remain largely unexplored except by hunters during limited seasons, and even hunters tend to focus on accessible areas near roads or established trails. Vast sections of forest see human visitors perhaps once or twice a year, if that. The cultural context also plays a role in why Mississippi might have more dogman encounters than other regions. The indigenous peoples who lived in this area for thousands of years before European contact had their own accounts of creatures that walked on 2 legs but were not human. The Choctaw spoke of beings they called Kashehotapalo, a man-like creature with a deer's head that lived in the forests. The Chickasaw had similar legends of shape-shifting beings that could appear human or animal. While these legends do not match dogman descriptions exactly, they suggest a long tradition of encounters with cryptid entities in these forests. The terrain itself has qualities that seem to concentrate unusual phenomena. The Mississippi River creates electromagnetic anomalies due to the movement of massive amounts of water through mineral-rich alluvial soil. The limestone geology underlying much of the region contributes to this, creating areas where magnetic compasses become unreliable and electronic devices malfunction. Whether these factors have any connection to dogman encounters remains speculative, but they do establish that this landscape has measurable physical properties that differ from surrounding regions. What I find most compelling about the Mississippi dogman encounters is the pattern of behavior the creatures display. They are not mindless monsters attacking anything they encounter, but intelligent beings that seem to have strategies for defending territory and hunting prey. The decision to surround and intimidate rather than directly attack suggests creatures that understand the capabilities of armed humans and choose tactics accordingly. The ability to coordinate movements across multiple individuals requires communication and social organization beyond what we see in typical pack predators like wolves or coyotes. The physical descriptions also remain remarkably consistent across encounters separated by decades. The 1948 witnesses and the 2022 witnesses described creatures with the same general size, shape, and behavioral traits, despite having no contact with each other and likely no knowledge of the other encounters. This consistency suggests either a genuine phenomenon or a cultural archetype so deeply embedded that witnesses unconsciously conform their reports to it. Given the credibility of many witnesses and the details they provide, I lean toward the former explanation. If dogman creatures do exist in Mississippi, what are they? The most commonly proposed theory is that they represent an unknown species of large canid, perhaps a surviving population of dire wolves or some other prehistoric predator that adapted to bipedal locomotion. Dire wolves went extinct roughly 11,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, but fossil evidence shows they were significantly larger and more robust than modern wolves. Could a population have survived in isolated refuges and evolved the ability to walk upright? It seems unlikely but not impossible. Another theory suggests dogman creatures might be an undiscovered species of primate, perhaps related to other reported cryptids like Bigfoot, but with more pronounced canine features. The forward-facing eyes, opposable digits, and bipedal stance all suggest primate traits, while the fur, muzzle, and ears indicate canine characteristics. Could we be looking at a convergent evolution between primate and canine body plans? The idea challenges what we know about mammalian evolution, but cannot be dismissed entirely without evidence. A third possibility, the one I find most troubling, is that Dogman creatures represent something we do not yet have the framework to understand. The Native American legends speak not of undiscovered animals, but of beings that exist between worlds, creatures that can manifest physically when conditions allow, and then vanish back into realms we cannot access. The recurring reports of encounters near burial mounds and sacred sites suggest these entities might be tied to specific locations with spiritual or geological significance. The skeptical explanation is that all Dogman encounters result from misidentification of known animals, usually bears standing upright or large dogs seen under poor lighting conditions. This explanation struggles to account for the details witnesses provide, the extended duration of many encounters, and the multiple witness sightings. It is possible for one person to misidentify a bear in brief glimpse, but it becomes much harder to explain how multiple trained observers like the loggers in 1948 could mistake a bear for something with hands, coordinated pack behavior, and sustained bipedal locomotion. My research continues, and I regularly receive new reports from people in Mississippi who have had their own encounters. Many witnesses are reluctant to come forward publicly, knowing the ridicule they will face, but they share their stories privately in the hope that someone will take them seriously. I have spoken with hunters who have abandoned favorite hunting spots after encounters. I have heard from property owners who have sold land and moved rather than continue living near active Dogman territories. What emerges from these accounts is a picture of Mississippi as a landscape where the boundary between known and unknown remains permeable. The forests here have not been fully tamed or mapped or stripped of their mysteries. In an age where we assume every corner of the continent has been explored and catalogued, Mississippi reminds us that vast areas remain wild in ways that matter. Whether Dogman creatures are flesh and blood animals, interdimensional entities, or something else entirely, the encounters persist. The state's combination of dense forests, abundant prey, low human population, and complex terrain creates conditions where a large predator could potentially remain undetected for decades or longer. The Mississippi River and its tributaries create natural migration routes that could allow creatures to move between territories without being seen. The seasonal flooding isolates sections of forest, creating refuges where even human hunters rarely penetrate. And the cultural history of the region, with its traditions of spirits and monsters, provides a framework for understanding encounters that mainstream science dismisses. Let me elaborate on what makes Mississippi's forests different from other regions in the southeast. The bottomland hardwood forests here are not the managed pine plantations you find in Georgia or the Carolinas. These are old ecosystems with trees that can live for centuries, creating a forest floor layered with decades of leaf litter, fallen logs, and standing dead wood. The understory grows so thick that visibility drops to a few yards in any direction, with vines and brush creating an impenetrable wall. Walking through these forests requires constant attention to footing and navigation. The cypress tupelo swamps add another layer of complexity. These wetlands can be several feet deep for months at a time, with cypress knees jutting up through the water and creating obstacles that make movement difficult even in boats. Alligators, cottonmouth snakes, and other dangers make casual exploration inadvisable, and most people who enter these swamps do so with extreme caution and preparation. For a creature that can move through these environments naturally, they provide perfect concealment and protection from human interference. The Mississippi Delta specifically has characteristics that set it apart from other river deltas in North America. The alluvial plain here is relatively narrow compared to deltas like the Sacramento or the Atchafalaya, but it extends for hundreds of miles north to south. This creates long corridors of suitable habitat that connect different regions of the state. A Dogman pack could potentially travel from the Tennessee border down to the Gulf Coast without ever leaving forest cover, using the network of tributaries and bottomlands as highways invisible to human observation. Water is everywhere in this landscape. Beyond the major rivers, there are countless creeks, oxbow lakes, sloughs, and seasonal wetlands. During heavy rain, which is frequent, the distinction between land and water blurs as forests flood, and drainage patterns shift. This constant moisture creates a different kind of forest than you would find in drier regions, with species adapted to having wet feet for extended periods. The trees here, oaks, hickories, ash, and gum, form dense stands that provide massed crops of nuts and seeds that support large populations of deer and other prey species. The soil itself contributes to the mystery. Mississippi's alluvial soils are among the richest in North America, laid down by millennia of flooding from the Mississippi River and its tributaries. These soils support incredible biodiversity, with plant communities so dense and varied that botanical surveys regularly discover species previously unknown in the region. If the plant life can hide surprises, why not the animal life as well? The assumption that all large mammals in North America have been catalogued and studied is based partly on the belief that there are no more surprises left in our forests. Mississippi challenges that assumption. Another factor worth considering is the pattern of human settlement in Mississippi. Unlike states farther west, where settlement followed a relatively orderly pattern of expansion, Mississippi's development has always been clustered and irregular. The richest agricultural land was settled first, while the wettest, most difficult terrain was largely bypassed. Even today you can find sections of forest that have never been logged, never been surveyed in detail, and rarely see human visitors. These are not wilderness areas in the legal sense, they are simply places too difficult or unprofitable to develop, and they remain wild by default rather than by design. The timber industry, which dominated Mississippi's economy for much of the 20th century, focused on the most accessible forests and the most valuable species. Large sections of bottomland hardwoods were considered too wet and too difficult to log profitably, so they were left alone. Now, with most of the easily accessible timber harvested, these remaining forests represent some of the oldest and least disturbed ecosystems in the state. If Dogman creatures exist, these are exactly the kind of places they would retreat to as human development encroached on other territories. Climate also plays a role. Mississippi has a humid subtropical climate with hot summers and mild winters. The state rarely sees snow, and freezing temperatures typically last only a few days at a time. This means the forests remain accessible and productive year-round, unlike northern forests where deep snow and prolonged cold limit both prey availability and predator activity. A large predator in Mississippi would not face the seasonal scarcity that wolves and bears endure in northern latitudes. Food remains abundant throughout the year, and shelter is always available in the dense vegetation. The hunting culture in Mississippi provides both challenges and opportunities for Dogman creatures. On one hand, the state has a strong tradition of deer hunting, with hundreds of thousands of hunters entering the forests each fall. On the other hand, hunting is concentrated in specific areas and specific seasons. Most hunters use tree stands overlooking food plots or travel corridors, meaning they observe small slices of the forest rather than exploring randomly. A creature that learns to avoid these high-traffic areas during hunting season could exist undetected by the vast majority of hunters. For those who live in rural Mississippi, the presence of something unknown in the forests is not a matter of belief, but of experience. They know the sound of every animal that lives in these woods, and they recognize when something does not fit. They understand the difference between a trick of light and shadow and the clear presence of a creature watching from the tree line. And they know that when night falls over these bottomland forests, the darkness holds more than deer and raccoons. Looking at the encounters I have researched, certain patterns emerge that deserve attention. The Dogman creatures show consistent behavior across different time periods and locations. They avoid direct confrontation with armed humans when possible, preferring intimidation and territorial displays over physical attacks. This suggests learned behavior, passed down through generations, an understanding that humans are dangerous when threatened, but can be driven away through psychological pressure alone. The intelligence this implies is sobering. The pack behavior is particularly interesting. Wolves hunt in coordinated packs, but their tactics are understood and documented by wildlife biologists. The coordination shown by Dogman creatures goes beyond typical pack hunting. The deliberate surrounding of the ranch in 1948, the flanking movements observed by the lineman, the blocking of the road by multiple creatures working together, All these suggest communication and planning at a level that challenges our understanding of animal intelligence. These are not instinctual responses, but strategic decisions made in real time based on circumstances. The vocalizations reported by witnesses also deserve analysis. The howling sounds like wolf howls, but with qualities that witnesses consistently describe as wrong or unnatural. Some witnesses mention a deeper resonance, as if the sounds come from a larger chest cavity than a wolf possesses. Others note patterns in the howls that suggest language rather than simple communication of territory or pack location. While we should be cautious about anthropomorphizing animal behavior, the consistency of these reports suggests the vocalizations serve complex purposes beyond what we see in known canids. The physical evidence, while limited, points towards something anomalous. The tracks found near encounter sites show characteristics that do not match known animals. The mix of bipedal and quadrupedal movement in the same trail is particularly difficult to explain with conventional wildlife. Bears can walk upright for short distances but leave distinctly different tracks and do not transition smoothly between gaits the way witnesses describe Dogman creatures doing. Large dogs leave tracks that are recognizable as canine, but lack the size and the hand-like qualities of the front paws that witnesses report seeing. The timing of encounters also shows patterns. Many sightings occur during the transitional periods of dawn and dusk, when both humans and predators are most active. This could simply reflect when people are most likely to be outdoors in rural areas, or it could indicate that Dogman creatures prefer low-light conditions for their activities. The summer months see more reports than winter, which could be due to increased human outdoor activity, or could suggest seasonal patterns in Dogman behavior. More research is needed to determine if these temporal patterns are significant or simply artifacts of reporting bias. The geographic clustering around Taylor is notable but not unique. Other areas of Mississippi show similar concentrations of encounters, particularly in the southern part of the state near the DeSoto National Forest and along the Pearl River corridor that forms the border with Louisiana. These are all areas with similar characteristics: extensive forest cover, minimal human population, abundant prey species, and difficult terrain. The fact that multiple hotspots exist rather than a single location suggests a broader population distributed across suitable habitats rather than one isolated group. The psychological impact on witnesses is something that cannot be ignored. People who have encountered Dogman creatures often describe lasting effects: difficulty sleeping, heightened anxiety in outdoor settings, and a fundamental change in how they view the natural world. These are not the reactions of people who saw a bear or a large dog and momentarily mistook it for something else. These are trauma responses to experiences that violated their understanding of what is possible. The depth and duration of these responses lend credibility to the witnesses' accounts. I have interviewed hunters with decades of experience in Mississippi forests who abandoned favorite hunting locations after Dogman encounters. These are people who understand wildlife, who have encountered bears and mountain lions in other states, who are not easily frightened or prone to imagination. When they say what they saw was not a known animal, that statement carries weight. They describe feeling an instinctual fear response that goes beyond normal caution, a primal recognition of a predator that sees them as potential prey rather than as the dominant species in the forest. The cultural response to Dogman encounters in Mississippi differs from other states. In Michigan and Wisconsin, Dogman sightings became part of popular culture, celebrated in songs and festivals. In Mississippi, there is more reluctance to discuss encounters publicly. This may reflect broader cultural differences in how rural southern communities handle unusual phenomena, a tendency toward privacy and a wariness of outside attention. But it means that reported encounters likely represent only a fraction of what actually occurs. The indigenous history of the region provides important context that is often overlooked. The Chickasaw and Choctaw peoples who lived in Mississippi for thousands of years had rich oral traditions that included beings that were neither fully human nor fully animal. While these traditions should not be simply mapped onto modern Dogman reports, they do establish that people have been encountering something unusual in these forests for a very long time. The continuity of encounters across cultures and centuries suggests a persistent phenomenon rather than modern folklore or mass delusion. Some researchers have proposed that Dogman creatures might be related to the cryptid known as the rougarou in Louisiana folklore. The rougarou is described as a wolf-headed creature that can walk upright, and sightings cluster in the swamps and forests along the Louisiana-Mississippi border. If the same species or phenomenon is being described by different cultural traditions using different names, it would explain the overlap in characteristics and geographic distribution. The question becomes whether we are looking at a biological entity or something that exists at the intersection of biology and folklore in ways we do not fully understand. The scientific establishment's rejection of Dogman encounters as evidence of an unknown species is understandable given the lack of physical proof. No bodies have been recovered, no bones found, no DNA samples collected from hair or scat. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in an environment as vast and difficult to search as Mississippi's bottomland forests. The gorilla was considered a myth by Western science until the mid-19th century, despite abundant local knowledge of its existence. The mountain gorilla was not scientifically described until 1902. The assumption that all large mammals have been discovered may prove as premature as similar assumptions made by scientists in previous centuries. What we need is a systematic approach to investigating Dogman encounters in Mississippi. This would require deploying camera traps in areas with high concentrations of reports, using thermal imaging to detect large, warm-blooded animals moving through the forests at night and collecting environmental DNA from water sources and soil samples. Modern technology makes this kind of investigation more feasible than ever before. The question is whether the scientific community is willing to invest resources in studying a phenomenon that most researchers still consider folklore rather than zoology. The encounters I have documented represent only a fraction of what happens in Mississippi's wilderness areas. For every person willing to share their story, how many others remain silent, either from fear of ridicule or from a simple desire to forget what they saw? The true number of Dogman encounters in the state likely exceeds reported cases by a significant margin. And if the pattern continues as it has for decades, more encounters will occur as people continue to venture into the deep forests. Mississippi's status as a Dogman hotspot results from a perfect convergence of factors: geography that provides habitat and concealment, prey populations that provide food, human populations that remain sparse and isolated, and cultural traditions that make the presence of such creatures feel almost expected. Whether these entities are unknown animals, supernatural beings, or something that defies our current categories does not change the impact they have on the people who encounter them. Those encounters transform how people view the landscape around them and what might be watching from the shadows when they walk through the woods at night. The question is not whether Mississippi has Dogman encounters. The evidence for that is extensive and consistent. The question is what we choose to do with that evidence. Do we dismiss it as folklore and misidentification, comfortable in our assumption that all large predators in North America have been discovered and catalogued? Or do we acknowledge that vast regions of this continent remain wild enough, remote enough, and mysterious enough to harbor creatures that have successfully avoided scientific documentation? I know which conclusion my research supports, and I know that the next time I walk through a Mississippi forest, I will be watching the tree line very carefully. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.